Oh my God.
A man arrived at the edge of town dragging something no one wanted to see, his horse barely alive, his wagon broken into pieces, and inside silence. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, because you know what silence means when there should be crying. The town watched from their porches as he pulled that wagon down Main Street, his boots leaving deep marks in the dust, like he was trying to dig his own grave with every step. His face was burned by the sun, his hands wrapped in cloth so dirty you couldn't tell where the wounds ended and the grime began. But it was his eyes that stopped people cold. Those eyes had seen something no human being should ever see, and he was about to prove it to everyone. People began following him without knowing why. Something terrible had happened out there in the desert, something that would change how this town looked at itself. And when he finally stopped in front of the sheriff's office and dropped that wagon handle to the ground, when he finally spoke the words everyone was dreading to hear, nobody would ever forget what he said. Next. This is the story of Jacob Brenner, a man who lost everything but refused to let the world forget what was lost. This is the story of 3 foals who never took a single breath of free air. And this is the story of how one man's refusal to accept darkness pulled an entire town into a reckoning with their own cruelty. The sun was climbing down the back of the sky when Jacob Brenner pulled his broken wagon into Saltwater Creek, that small desert town that nobody important had ever come from. It was a Wednesday in late August, and the heat was the kind that made the air look wet even though it was drier than bone. The temperature had been over 105 degrees since dawn, and the wind carried that burnt smell that only comes when everything good has been cooked away from the earth. His horse was the color of an old penny, barely brown anymore, just pale and dusty. Its ribs showed in sharp lines like someone had painted them on. The animal walked with its head down, not because it was respectful, but because it genuinely believed the ground might open up and swallow its suffering. Each step was a question that had no answer. The wagon it was pulling had been a decent buckboard once, the kind ranchers used to move supplies and small livestock. Now it was held together by hope and habit. The right wheel was bent inward, making the whole thing lean like a drunk man. The wooden sides had cracked in a pattern that looked like lightning strikes. The canvas cover that used to stretch across the top had been shredded, hanging in strips that moved when the wind touched them, making the wagon look like something dying. Jacob Brenner walked beside the horse instead of riding it. His boots were cracked from the desert sun and dust, and they looked too small for his feet, like they were made for someone who didn't exist anymore. He wore a shirt that had once been blue, but the desert had turned it into something between gray and brown, stained dark with sweat across the shoulders and back. His hat was pulled so low you could barely see his face, just the lower part, burned so dark it looked like the skin had changed color from the inside. His hands were wrapped in strips of old cloth, and those strips were stained brown that might have been blood or might have been something darker, but it was his eyes that told the real story. When he finally looked up as he approached the first buildings of town, his eyes were the eyes of a man who had been awake for too long, who had seen something that had rewired his brain into a different shape. They weren't crazy eyes. They were worse than that. They were eyes that had made a decision about something, and that decision had changed him into someone new. People of Saltwater Creek noticed him the way people notice accidents. Mrs. Helen Chun was watering her garden in front of the general store when she saw him. She stopped moving, her hand frozen in the air, water from the bucket running down her dress. Old Tom Hutchins was sitting in the wooden chair outside the sheriff's office, the same chair he'd been sitting in for 20 years, and he stood up slow, his bones creaking. Sarah Moss, who worked at the boarding house, stepped into her doorway and put her hand on her throat. They all felt it at the same moment, the way animals feel when a storm is coming, when the air changes and your body knows before your mind does. The wagon made an awful sound as Jacob dragged it forward. The bent wheel scraped against the ground in a rhythm that sounded like something screaming, if something could hold a note for that long. The sound was horrible, but it wasn't the worst sound on that street. The worst sound was what wasn't there. There was no jingle of harness, no creak of leather, no normal sounds of travel. There was just the grinding of the broken wheel and the desperate breathing of the dying horse and the sound of cloth strips hanging from the wagon moving in air that barely moved. People came out onto the street. They came from the saloon and from the church and from their homes. They came without planning to pull toward this thing the way people are pulled toward terrible things. A young boy named Peter, no more than 8 years old, started to run toward the wagon, but his mother caught him by the arm and held him back so hard he made a sound of pain. She didn't let go. She didn't explain why. She just held him there and made him watch. Jacob walked his wagon straight down Main Street, past all these people, past their stares and their questions that they didn't ask, because something about this situation was already telling them not to speak. He walked past the feed store and the blacksmith's shop. He walked past the houses with their white painted fences and their gardens that looked like they believed in hope. He walked past all of it like a ghost might walk, like he was already becoming something that wasn't quite alive anymore. The smell hit them as he passed. It was thick and wrong, the smell of things that had gone bad in heat, the smell that gets into your clothes and your hair and your skin and doesn't leave for weeks. People covered their mouths and noses. Some of them turned away, but they didn't leave. Nobody left. He finally stopped in front of Sheriff's office, and when he did, it was like the whole town let out a breath they'd been holding. The horse simply stood there, not even swaying anymore, just standing because movement had become impossible. Jacob dropped the wagon handle, and it fell to the ground with a sound like a question being asked that had no answer. He stood there for a moment, his wrapped hands hanging at his sides, his face still hidden under that hat. Then he looked up, and when he did, he looked at Sheriff William Garrett, who had stepped out onto the porch. What Jacob said in that moment would be repeated in this town for the rest of everyone's life. He said it quietly, and he said it like a man delivering news that would break something important inside everyone who heard it. He said, "Sheriff, I need you to look in my wagon. I need witnesses. And I need everyone to know what the men from the Crescent Ranch did to these foals while they waited to be sold to the slaughterhouse in Denver." The wagon didn't move, nobody moved. But something inside everyone shifted, like the ground had moved just slightly beneath their feet. And everything that came after this moment would be the aftermath of standing in a place that was no longer where it used to be. Sheriff William Garrett was a man who had seen a lot in his 47 years. He had seen men shot in anger and men hanged in justice. He had seen drought and flood and fire. He had seen women cry for their dead and children born into poverty. But when he looked into that wagon, when he actually looked at what was lying there on the bed of rotting straw, he had to turn away and lean against the side of the building because his stomach was telling him to empty itself. The three foals lay on top of each other like they had tried to climb away from what was happening to them and had failed so completely that they had simply given up and died in a pile. None of them was more than 3 months old. They should have been beautiful things at that age, with their long legs and their dark eyes that looked too big for their heads. Those eyes that newborn horses have that look like they're seeing wonder in every direction. These foals did not look like that anymore. These foals looked like they had been born into a mistake that the world had forgotten to stop. The smallest one was in the middle, and its legs were still bent in the position of running or trying to run, which meant it had been alive while the wagon was moving. Alive while the heat was cooking it from the outside and the fear was cooking it from the inside. Its ribs were more visible than anything alive should allow. The skin was pulled tight across its body, so tight you could see every individual bone, every space between, like someone had made a drawing of what a horse skeleton should look like and then forgotten to add the meat. The fur was matted with dried blood and something darker, something that looked like it had come from inside. The second foal was lying on its side, and one of its eyes was still partially open. That eye had clouded over, the way eyes do when there's nobody home behind them anymore. But it was still open, still staring at nothing, still asking the question that would never get an answer. The mouth was slightly open too, and the gums had turned a shade of purple that wasn't natural. that spoke of pain and suffering that had gone on for long enough to change the color of living tissue. The hooves were cracked and bleeding, and it looked like this one had pawed at the bottom of the wagon until all of its strength gave out. The largest one, the one that had probably been the strongest when this had started, was pressed against the wooden side of the wagon. It had twisted its neck at an angle that couldn't have been comfortable, and it had stayed twisted at that angle after death. So now it looked like it was trying to look away from what had happened, even in death still trying to escape something it couldn't understand. There was a wound on its shoulder that looked deliberate, like someone had struck it with something sharp, and the wound had gotten infected in the heat, had turned black and purple and swollen. Dr. Eleanor Morrison was in the crowd now. She had come from her clinic when she heard the sounds and the commotion.
She was a woman who had learned medicine by doing it, who had treated gunshot wounds and births and diseases without the kind of proper training that people in bigger cities had. When she looked into that wagon, she pushed past the sheriff and climbed up on the wagon bed itself, stepping over the foals, kneeling down beside the largest one. She put her hand on its body, and her face went through several emotions at once. Shock, yes. Horror, yes. But also something else. Anger that was so pure and so hot that you could see it in her shoulders, in the way her hands were shaking. This one, she said, and her voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep underground. This one was alive when he arrived, not long ago, maybe 6 hours, maybe less. Look at the blood. Look at how it's not completely dried. This one died in this town. This one died while we were all going about our business, eating supper and complaining about the heat. Jacob Brenner stood where he was, not moving, not looking at the wagon, just standing in the space he had claimed when he arrived. His horse had finally sat down, a thing horses do when they have decided that standing is no longer something they're willing to do. It just folded its legs and dropped to the ground, dust rising up around it in a cloud that slowly settled. A man named Robert Kellerman, who owned the Crescent Ranch just outside of town, had been in the saloon when Jacob arrived. He heard about it from someone who came in running, and he came out to the street to see what the commotion was about. When he saw what was in the wagon, when he understood what Jacob was saying, his face went absolutely white. Not the kind of white that comes from fear, but the kind that comes from understanding that something you thought was hidden was now completely visible. That something you believed you could get away with was now standing in the middle of Main Street for everyone to see. He turned around and started walking away, back toward his horse that was tied up outside the saloon. But before he could make it more than a few steps, Jacob moved. It was the first time since he'd arrived that Jacob had shown any kind of energy, any kind of purpose beyond pulling that wagon. He stepped in front of Kellerman, and he said something so quietly that only Kellerman could hear it. Kellerman's face went white again, but this time it was a different kind of white. It was the white of a man who was understanding that his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined possible. Sheriff Garrett watched all of this, and he understood that something ancient was happening, something older than law, something that existed before courts and judges. He understood that Jacob Brenner hadn't come to town to seek justice. He had come to town to demand that everyone watch while something tried to happen that was bigger than justice, something that might have been called reckoning. Robert Kellerman made it to his horse. He had moved fast, faster than a man his size should be able to move, and he had untied the reins with shaking hands. Sheriff Garrett was moving toward him but not running, just walking the way a man walks when he knows he's going to get there eventually anyway. There was no need to run. Kellerman wasn't trying to escape justice. He was trying to escape the truth, and that was a much more impossible thing to run from. But before Kellerman could mount his horse, Jacob spoke. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. The whole town had gone quiet in that way that happens when everyone is waiting for someone to say the thing that everything has been building toward. Jacob said, his men beat them in the pen for 3 days because he said they were too weak to make the journey to Denver. He said they would die anyway, so there was no point in wasting water or feed. He said breaking their spirits was the same as mercy because it meant they wouldn't struggle on the journey. The silence that followed this statement was the kind of silence that has weight. It pressed down on everyone who heard it. A woman in the crowd made a sound like she was being hurt, An old man spit on the ground. Someone's child asked their parent what it meant, and the parent didn't answer, just held their child tighter and turned away. Jacob continued, and his voice didn't change, didn't get louder, didn't show emotion. He just stated facts, like a man reading from a document. I bought these 3 foals 2 months ago. I had them in a pasture north of Kellerman's land. I was raising them right, giving them what they needed. And then Kellerman came to me and said he wanted to buy them back. Said he had a buyer in Denver who would pay good money for young stock. I said no, they were mine, and they were going to stay mine. Robert Kellerman's hands froze on the saddle. His horse, sensing his panic, began to shift beneath him, nervous about the current of fear that was running through its rider's body. Jacob said, So Kellerman sent his men, not to steal them, to break them, to make them too weak to survive so that I would have to sell them to him cheap, and then he could sell them to Denver like they had just died of natural causes on the journey. I found the fence cut. I found them in my pasture starving. They had been without water for days. The men had come and driven them hard, made them run until they collapsed, and then they left them there to die slow. I loaded them into my wagon because I thought I could get them to the vet in the next town over. But the road was too long, and the heat was too hot, and they died anyway. Now Jacob finally looked at Robert Kellerman directly, and when he did, everyone could see what was in his eyes. It wasn't rage. It was worse than rage. It was the kind of disappointment that comes when you realize that the world is made of people who are willing to hurt innocent things for profit, who are willing to make life itself into something cruel and pointless. Jacob said, I came here because I want everyone to know. I want the record to show that Robert Kellerman is a man who will hurt animals that depend on humans for protection. I want people to know that he will send men to do violence for money. And I want to know why, in a town that calls itself civilized, this man was allowed to walk around free for as long as he has been. That was the moment when everything broke. Robert Kellerman tried to mount his horse, and Dr. Eleanor Morrison stepped in front of him. She was a small woman, but she was blocking his path with her entire body, and something about her determination made him stop. Sheriff Garrett arrived then, and he put his hand on Kellerman's shoulder, and Kellerman tried to shrug him off, but the sheriff held firm. Robert Kellerman, the sheriff said, and there was a quality in his voice that hadn't been there before, a coldness that suggested that the man he had known, or thought he had known, was someone different from who was standing in front of him now. I'm going to need you to come to my office. We're going to talk about what happened to these animals. And after that, we're going to talk about whether what you did was just cruel, or whether it was something that the law has a name for. 3 of Kellerman's ranch hands appeared then, coming from different parts of town. They had probably been watching, had probably come to see if their boss needed help. But when they saw the wagon, when they understood what was being said, they simply turned around and left town. They didn't run. They just walked toward the edge of town and kept going, and nobody tried to stop them. They were the kind of men who understood that they had been part of something that couldn't be talked away anymore, that couldn't be fixed with money, or lies, or the simple passage of time. As Kellerman was being led to the sheriff's office, he tried to say something. His mouth opened and closed several times like a fish, like he was trying to find words that didn't exist for what he was going through. He finally said, They were just foals. They would have died anyway in Denver. I was just being practical about it. And that was the moment when the town of Saltwater Creek understood that they were all part of something that had been rotten for much longer than anyone wanted to admit. That understanding would change how they looked at themselves and at each other, and at the simple question of what we owe to the things we say we own. Nobody in Saltwater Creek really knew Jacob Brenner's story. That was the thing that struck people afterward, when everything had started to settle and the immediate shock had worn off enough to think about other things. Jacob had been coming to town for supplies for 3 years, and people had seen him but had never really looked at him. They had never asked him about his life, or where he had come from, or what brought him to this desert place where nothing grew easy and everything cost too much. Dr. Eleanor Morrison learned the story because she took him to her clinic after the wagon situation was handled. His hands were infected from the burns and the work of pulling that wagon. He needed water and rest and care that had to do with his body's needs rather than his soul's needs, though the two had gotten tangled up somewhere along the way. As she cleaned his wounds and wrapped them in fresh cloth, Jacob talked. He didn't seem to be talking to her specifically. He seemed to be talking to the story itself, the way some people talk to the past when they're trying to make sure it gets remembered right. He told her about his wife, Sarah. She had died 10 years ago, not from sickness but from an accident with a horse that was being beaten by its owner. Sarah had been trying to stop the man, had stepped in between the whip and the animal, and the owner, drunk and angry, had hit her instead of the horse. She had died 3 days later from the bleeding in her head. The man who killed her had paid a fine and nothing else. He had paid $75, and that was considered justice in the town where Jacob had lived before. $75 for a human life. The man had gone on to beat more animals, and people had known it, and nobody had done anything about it. After Sarah died, Jacob had needed to leave. He couldn't stay in a place where the man who killed his wife could walk into the same stores and sit in the same churches and breathe the same air without consequence. So he had come to this desert, to this edge place where people were more spread out, where he could exist more easily alone. He had built a small ranch, nothing fancy, just enough to survive, and he had decided that if he ever saw cruelty again, if he ever saw someone hurt something that couldn't hurt back, he would do something about it. He didn't know what exactly. He just knew he wouldn't let it pass the way it had passed before. Then, 3 months before he brought the wagon to town, he had found the 3 foals. They were being sold by a breeder in the next territory over, young and healthy and so full of life that they made Jacob believe in the future again. He had paid good money for them, had brought them to his ranch, had started feeding them and training them and planning what they might become. He had given them names. The smallest one he called Patience. The second one he called Justice. The largest one he called Grace. He stood in front of the court and told the story of finding the 3 foals, and of the 3 days it took to pull the wagon to town, and of how Grace had died just as the sun was coming up. He talked about the names he had given them, and about how they had been learning things, growing things, becoming things. He talked about the space in his ranch where he had planned to have a paddock someday, and how he would never build that paddock now because there would never be young horses to run in it. But what Jacob said that made people cry, that made even the judge have to take off her glasses and clean them, was this: "These foals never hurt anyone. They never asked for anything except food and water and a chance to live, and they were killed because one man decided that his profit was more important than their lives. That's the kind of world we're choosing to live in. That's the kind of people we're choosing to be. And I needed everyone to see it. I needed everyone to know exactly what that choice looks like when you don't look away." The jury was out for only 3 hours. They came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Robert Kellerman was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and his ranch was ordered to be sold, with the proceeds going to establish an animal sanctuary that would be named after Grace, Justice, and Patience. The law had worked, barely, and everyone understood that it had worked not because the law was good, but because Jacob had refused to let anyone look away. In the weeks that followed, things changed in Saltwater Creek. It was not a dramatic change, not like the whole town suddenly became noble and kind. But it was real. People started watching how animals were treated. Someone established an animal protection organization. A veterinary clinic was opened a few towns over, and people made a point to take their horses there when something seemed wrong. When a man from another town came through with clearly abused animals, people reported it to the authorities. It wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't even particularly remarkable. But it was something. It was the recognition that how we treat the things that cannot speak or fight back matters, that this is a measure of who we are. Jacob didn't stay in Saltwater Creek. Once the trial was over, once the land was settled and the sanctuary was being built, he packed what he owned into saddlebags and rode out of town without saying goodbye to anyone. Sheriff Garrett tried to stop him, tried to convince him to stay, to help build the sanctuary, to be part of making sure that what happened to Grace and Justice and Patience would lead to something good. But Jacob shook his head and just kept riding. He rode for 3 months, through desert and through prairie, through small towns and through the open land, where you could see the horizon in every direction. He let his horse lead him places, and he thought about Sarah, and about the 3 foals, and about all the things that had been hurt that the world had never seen or cared about. He thought about the man who had killed his wife, and who had walked free, and about how some things cannot be made right because the loss is too complete, because the dead stay dead no matter what justice you build around them. But he also thought about the jury that had voted to convict Kellerman. He thought about Dr. Morrison's careful testimony. He thought about Margaret Chen standing in court and saying that the law should protect all living things. He thought about the sanctuary that would someday have horses running in it, horses that had been saved because 3 foals had died and someone had refused to hide that death. A year after the trial, he came back to Saltwater Creek. Nobody was expecting him, so when people saw him riding down Main Street, it was like seeing a ghost that had decided to come back and check on things. He had changed. His face was weathered darker, and his hair had gone mostly grey, and his shoulders seemed a little bent, like he was carrying something heavy that no one else could see. But his eyes had changed too. They were still sad, still carrying the weight of loss, but they were not the same eyes that had pulled that wagon into town. These eyes had learned something about how the world works, about how sometimes the only thing you can do is plant a seed and let someone else tend the garden. He went to the sanctuary. It was still being built, but there were already 4 horses there, horses that had been rescued from situations similar to the one that had claimed grace and justice and patience. He stood at the fence and watched them run, and Dr. Morrison, who had become the sanctuary's director, stood beside him in silence. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. They were both understanding the same thing at that moment, which was that small good things could come from terrible things if people chose to make them come, and that the choice to do that was the only choice that mattered. Jacob stayed in Saltwater Creek for the rest of his life. He didn't talk much about what had happened, and people learned not to ask him about it. But every spring, on the anniversary of the day he had pulled the wagon into town, he would spend the entire day at the sanctuary, and he would tell anyone who asked that he was just checking on things, just making sure that 3 foals who had never lived to be horses were remembered in the hearts of horses that had been saved. The town understood that this was his way of making sense of the loss, his way of keeping grace and justice and patience alive in the world. And every person who came to the sanctuary, every person who saw horses running free in a place built, because one man had refused to accept that cruelty could be hidden, every person who understood that small acts of witness could become something larger than themselves, they understood something that Sarah Brenner would have understood, and that the 3 foals would have understood if they had lived long enough to understand anything. They understood that the measure of a civilization is not what happens in its courts or its halls of power, but what happens when an ordinary person stands up and says that the suffering of innocent things cannot be invisible, that death cannot be meaningless, and that the world can be changed by the simple, impossible act of refusing to look away. Jacob Brenner never ran again after his wife died. He never felt joy the way he had felt it when he was young. But he felt something else. Something that was built on the rubble of loss, and that was somehow more real, more true, and infinitely more necessary than joy had ever been. He felt purpose. And he spent the rest of his days making sure that in this one small corner of the world, in this one town in the desert, the lives of animals that nobody important had ever cared about would matter. They would be remembered. And they would change the way humans understood their responsibility to the living things that looked to them for protection and care.